Ukraine has just captured one of Russia's newest tanks, but the tank itself may not be the most important part of the story. At first glance, this may look like just another loss in a war already filled with burning vehicles, stalled assaults, and crews forced to abandon their equipment on the battlefield. But this case is different. What matters more is that from this very failure, Ukraine may have gained more than a standard battlefield trophy. So what exactly happened during that assault that made a seemingly routine loss stand out so clearly? And beyond the tank itself, what else did Ukraine gain that makes this capture far more significant than it appears on the surface? Stay with Military Force to find out. What happened in this small Russian assault mattered because it exposed a larger truth about modern ground war. A mechanized push moved toward a village in eastern Ukraine, with tanks and armored personnel carriers approaching from different directions in an effort to create a local breakthrough on the defensive line. On paper, this did not look like a major operation. It was limited in scale, narrow in purpose, and focused on one settlement rather than a wide section of the front. Yet that is exactly why it deserves attention. Small assaults often reveal battlefield change more clearly than larger offensives, because they show what happens when military planning meets battlefield reality under pressure. In this case, that reality was severe. Russia still depended on armored vehicles to apply tactical pressure, move troops under protection, and force a response from Ukrainian defenders. That logic has shaped mechanized warfare for decades. Armor offers mobility, direct firepower, and a degree of protection. For that reason, even a small mechanized thrust can still carry military weight, especially when it is designed to test a weak point or stretch a defense. But the battlefield in Ukraine has changed the conditions under which those advantages can survive. A force can still move with tanks and APCs, but movement itself is now more exposed, more closely watched, and more vulnerable to disruption than in earlier wars. That is what this assault revealed. The issue was not simply that the Russian push failed. The deeper point was that it began to lose coherence early, before it could fully develop into a real attack. That matters because modern assaults depend on timing as much as force. Vehicles must arrive in sequence. Supporting fire must match movement. Units advancing from different directions must apply pressure at the same moment. Once that rhythm is broken, the attack stops being a coordinated push and starts becoming a group of isolated targets. Ukraine has become increasingly effective at creating that kind of disruption. Instead of relying on one layer of defense, it has shown an ability to connect battlefield awareness, firepower, and rapid reaction into a tight interception chain. That means even a limited Russian advance can become risky long before it reaches the position where armor was supposed to matter most. This is why a battle around one village says more than its size would suggest. It points to a wider shift in land warfare, where armored vehicles still matter, but no longer control tempo as confidently as before. Ukraine disrupted this Russian assault at the approach stage, and that detail explains why the entire attack began losing shape so quickly. The Russian force moved toward the village from several directions, which suggests an attempt to pressure the defense from more than one angle. In theory, that method can stretch defenders, divide attention, and create an opening for armor to push through. It can also force the defending side to decide where to send fire first. But this plan only works when timing stays intact. If the separate elements do not remain aligned, the same movement can create confusion inside the attacking force. That risk becomes even greater when the attackers are moving across exposed ground under constant observation. Ukraine detected the direction of the attack early and reacted before the Russian vehicles could settle into an assault pattern. This matters because the first minutes of a mechanized push are fragile. Crews are still moving into position. Distances between vehicles are still changing. Commanders are still reading terrain and trying to keep different elements on the same pace. If that process is interrupted early, the assault can begin to come apart before it reaches the point where armor is expected to do its main work. Battlefield pressure also punishes small delays. A vehicle that slows too early can expose the one behind it. a change in route can disturb spacing. A short pause under fire can force the formation to react. Once that begins, the problem spreads beyond one vehicle or one crew. It starts affecting the rhythm of the whole push. Ukraine's response showed a connection between different forms of fire. Artillery appears to have disrupted the formation, and that matters because artillery does not always need to destroy vehicles to be effective. It can force crews to slow down, shift routes, or bunch together in ways that make them easier to track. That alone can damage the timing of an attack. Once that timing is shaken, anti-tank fire becomes more dangerous because vehicles are no longer moving in a clean sequence. Then FPV drones can exploit the delay by chasing targets that have become easier to identify and harder to protect. This layered response matters more than any single strike. A mechanized assault depends on rhythm. One vehicle moves, another covers, supporting fire keeps pressure on defenders, and the formation tries to arrive with enough force at the same moment. When artillery breaks spacing, anti-tank fire forces hesitation and drones keep pressure on exposed vehicles, the attack stops functioning as one action. It starts breaking into fragments. Some crews move forward, others slow down. Others try to avoid fire. The force may still be present physically, but it is no longer acting as a unified assault group. That is why the danger zone in this battle did not begin at the village edge. It began much earlier, during the process of approach. In older assumptions about armored warfare, the most dangerous point was often the final push into defended positions. Here, the danger had already expanded backward into the movement phase itself. The road, the open ground before the objective, and the gaps between vehicles all became part of the contested space. That shift is one of the clearest signs of how warfare in Ukraine has changed. The approach is no longer just a route to battle. It has become part of the battle. This is also why the Russian force lost more than momentum. It lost the conditions needed for a breakthrough. Even before reaching the objective, the assault had been slowed, split, and placed under enough pressure to weaken its purpose. And in that moment of delay, confusion, one detail emerged. One Russian tank was not destroyed at once, but it was left behind in battlefield disorder that could turn a damaged assault into a much bigger loss. One Russian tank got through the first wave of fire, but that did not protect it from becoming one of the most important losses in the assault. After surviving the initial danger, the vehicle collided with a damaged armored platform and was forced to stop in a part of the battlefield already under pressure and likely under observation. That detail matters because in this war, survival is no longer measured only by whether a vehicle is burning. A tank can remain intact, keep its gun, and still be removed from the fight if it loses mobility at the wrong place and moment. The vehicle was not immediately destroyed, yet it was no longer functioning as a fighting platform. Once it stopped, its role changed. It became a fixed object inside a dangerous zone. That shift can happen faster than older assumptions about armored warfare would suggest. In earlier combat logic, a halted vehicle could still be seen as recoverable if it had not been destroyed and if friendly forces still held enough control nearby. But that assumption depends on time, space, and local security. All three are much harder to preserve on a battlefield shaped by drones, rapid targeting, and constant pressure on exposed movement. A stranded tank in that environment is not simply disabled. It is trapped inside a shrinking window of survival. The collision with a wrecked vehicle made that problem worse. Any obstacle in a narrow approach lane can block movement, expose following vehicles, and turn one delay into a wider loss of tempo. For the crew inside, that was not just a technical problem. It was a psychological shock. A tank crew under battlefield pressure knows that a halt in open or contested ground can invite danger from several directions at once. Even if the vehicle still works in part, the crew cannot assume there will be enough time to restart, reverse, repair, or wait safely for support. That is especially true in a battlefield where FPV drones can appear quickly, artillery can return to a marked position, and anti-tank teams can exploit hesitation. Under those conditions, every minute inside a stalled vehicle feels more dangerous than the last. That helps explain why the crew abandoned the tank in confusion rather than trying to hold it longer. Their decision reflected the brutal logic of a battlefield where mobility has become part of protection itself. This is one of the clearest signs of how armored warfare has changed in Ukraine. A tank no longer has to be destroyed in one dramatic strike to be neutralized. It can be removed from battle through interruption, obstruction, and loss of movement at a critical point. That makes battlefield geometry more important than before. The exact place where a vehicle stops now matters almost as much as the damage it takes. If it stops in a watched corridor, near wreckage, under fire pressure, or ahead of friendly support, its combat value can collapse with surprising speed. That is why this abandoned tank became a turning point in the story. Its loss was not simply another image of a failed Russian push. It marked the moment when a tactical setback began turning into something more serious. It also showed how quickly battlefield pressure can turn one stalled vehicle into an operational problem, especially when surveillance, drone threat, and broken formation all converge at the same point. At that point, the story no longer rests only on battlefield damage. It begins to move toward the intelligence and technological value that may now sit inside the abandoned machine. Ukraine's recovery of the abandoned Russian tank mattered because it turned a battlefield loss into a possible intelligence gain. Once Ukrainian forces were able to approach the vehicle at night, start it, and move it away, the meaning of the incident changed immediately. This was no longer only about one side losing a piece of armor during a failed assault. It also showed that Russia no longer held real control over that part of the field after the attack had broken down. A damaged vehicle can still remain part of the battle if friendly forces keep the area around it secure. But once the opposing side can reach it, operate it, and remove it, the vehicle stops being a battlefield asset and starts becoming a source of information. The machine itself had value, but the larger importance lay in what it could tell Ukraine about Russian battlefield adaptation. The real focus should therefore rest less on the tank as a weapon and more on the systems attached to it. That is especially true if the vehicle carried updated anti-drone measures or electronic protection designed to help it survive in a battlefield shaped by FPV strikes and constant surveillance. In that case, the most important gain would not be steel, firepower, or spare parts. It would be insight. Ukraine may now have a chance to study how Russia is trying to protect armored vehicles under modern drone pressure. That could include jamming equipment, signal protection, altered fittings, or other field modifications intended to reduce vulnerability from above. Even a limited look at such systems can reveal a great deal. It can show what Russian crews and engineers believe the main threat now is. It can also show whether the system was built for real battlefield use or whether it was only a rough solution added under urgent pressure. That is why captured equipment matters in a war like this. It gives one side the chance to examine not just what the other side has, but how it thinks. That matters because adaptation in modern war is often cumulative rather than dramatic. One side introduces a new layer of protection. The other studies it, tests it, and searches for weak points. Then the cycle begins again. A recovered vehicle can therefore offer more than technical curiosity or propaganda value. It can reveal design choices, tactical assumptions, and the practical limits of a new defensive idea. Ukraine may be able to assess what this system was meant to stop, how it was expected to work in combat, and where it may fail under real pressure. Knowledge like that can shape future drone tactics more effectively than watching from a distance. The recovery also says something wider about this war. In earlier conflicts, a captured tank often mattered for symbolic reasons or material reuse. In Ukraine, the stakes are higher because the pace of adaptation is much faster. What looks like one abandoned vehicle may actually contain evidence of a broader Russian effort to keep armor alive in a battlefield, saturated with drones and precision fire. Yet that technological gain is only one half of the picture. The other half lies in the way Ukraine keeps applying continuous drone pressure, making armored vehicles harder not only to protect, but even to recover once disruption begins. Ukraine's use of FPV drones shows that their real power does not always lie in one strike alone. It lies in the ability to keep pressure on a target until that target loses combat value. That is what makes this method so important. The first hit does not always need to destroy a Russian vehicle outright. In many cases, it only needs to slow it down, expose its position, damage a key part, or force the crew into a rush decision. Once that happens, the vehicle enters a more dangerous stage. It is no longer moving with confidence. It is no longer protected by clean timing. It is no longer able to support the rest of the formation in the same way. At that point, the target becomes easier to track and easier to finish. The psychological effect also grows because every second after the first hit increases uncertainty, pressure, and the risk of total loss. This is why the idea of sequential attack matters so much. One drone can create the first disruption, but the real effect often comes from what follows next. A second strike can hit the same vehicle after it has stopped. Another can target it once the crew has lost control or has been forced to leave. Further pressure can make recovery impossible and turn a damaged platform into a total loss. In this logic, the goal is not simply to score a dramatic hit. The goal is to extend vulnerability over time until the vehicle can no longer fight, move safely, or return to action. This changes the meaning of drone warfare. FPV systems are no longer just flying explosives used for isolated attacks. They are becoming part of a broader method of battlefield control. What matters most is not only physical damage. It is the way repeated drone pressure can break timing, isolate a vehicle from support, and turn one moment of weakness into a lasting battlefield disadvantage. That is how a small drone can help produce a larger operational effect. A vehicle that has already been hit can still remain inside the kill chain. It can continue to draw danger after partial damage, because the strike sequence is designed to deny survival, deny recovery, and deny further use. That makes battlefield pressure more continuous than it first appears. For armored vehicles, this creates a serious problem. Thick armor and strong firepower still matter, but they are no longer enough by themselves. Survival now depends more on avoiding detection, keeping movement, and escaping the period after first contact when disruption can turn into destruction. A tank or APC that remains too long in a watched area may become vulnerable even if it survives the first strike. That is why this Ukrainian method is effective. It does not rely on one perfect blow. It relies on building pressure step by step until the target loses practical value. And because that pattern is becoming clearer with each engagement, Russia is being pushed toward new defensive measures under growing drone pressure. Russia is trying to adapt to the drone threat, but the repeated outcomes suggest that adaptation alone is not solving the deeper problem. The protective measures seen on Russian armored vehicles show that the threat from above is no longer treated as temporary. Cage armor, added protection, and jamming systems all point to the same conclusion. Russian forces understand that low sky over the battlefield has become dangerous, and that armored vehicles can no longer rely on speed, steel, and firepower alone to survive. These changes are not cosmetic. They are signs that drone pressure is forcing tactical adjustment. At the same time, these solutions come with costs. Extra protection adds weight. A heavier vehicle can lose mobility, respond more slowly, and face difficulty moving through narrow or damaged routes. Added structures can also limit visibility, which matters in close combat or confused terrain. Jamming systems may help in some situations, but they do not remove every danger, and they can place pressure on coordination inside an assault group. The result is a difficult trade-off. Measures to improve survival can also reduce the speed and flexibility that mechanized attacks depend on. That tension becomes more serious when assault units must move fast, react under fire, and keep formation across exposed ground. That is why similar failures continue to appear. In another example from the same pattern, the lead vehicle hit a mine, came under drone pursuit, and triggered a wider breakdown in the assault. The crew abandoned the vehicle, the formation lost coherence, and the push failed before reaching its goal. This matters because the problem was not limited to one machine. It affected the whole structure of the attack. Once the lead element was stopped, the rest of the group became more exposed, less coordinated, and easier to disrupt in sequence. This repeated outcome shows that Ukraine is doing more than destroying individual vehicles. It is striking at the method behind the assault itself. The point of pressure is not only armor thickness or equipment quality, it is timing, formation control, and the ability to keep moving after the first interruption. If those things break down, even improved vehicles may still fail to deliver a breakthrough. And when the same pattern keeps returning despite efforts to adapt, this battle stops looking like an isolated setback. It begins to suggest that the balance between armored assault and drone pressure is shifting more deeply across the battlefield. What happened in this small assault says far more than the size of the battle would suggest. A Russian mechanized push toward one village was broken before it could produce a real breakthrough, and the abandoned tank became the clearest sign that the battlefield is changing in deeper ways. Its capture mattered not only because Russia lost a vehicle, but because Ukraine may have gained insight into how Russian armor is trying to survive under drone pressure. That turns one failed attack into something larger than a local setback. It shows that modern war is no longer decided by armor alone, or by firepower alone. It is increasingly shaped by how quickly one side can detect movement, disrupt timing, sustain pressure, and learn from every contact. From that perspective, this was not simply a failed assault. It was a warning that the side able to connect surveillance, strike power, and adaptation fastest may hold the real advantage. War reveals how technology evolves, but it also shows the cost behind every decision on the battlefield. Understanding these changes is not about glorifying conflict, but about recognizing how fragile peace can be. Subscribe to Military Force to follow the facts, the strategy, and the reality behind modern war.